Welcome, everybody. This is the York Cafe Scientific, which is organised by the Yorkshire Philosophical Society. And we're delighted that Alex Harvey has agreed to give us his Little Kingdoms, An A to Z of Early Medieval Britain, which is his new book that was published in November. So do look out for it and buy it when you've finished listening to his talk. And Alex is an archaeologist, a lecturer, and an excellent speaker. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy this evening. And I believe this is his third book.
That's correct. Number three.
Yeah, I'm just going to silence myself. And could I just ask that people also.
Okay, I think everyone is on mute now. Well, if there's nothing else, I will begin. Thank you very much for, I say, coming down. Most of you, I assume, are sat at desks or maybe comfortable with a cup of tea or a beer if you're not doing dry January. Thank you for joining us virtually. Thank you to the YPS for agreeing to let me repeat this talk from December. And also thank you to the various archaeological societies who have spread the good word about it around circles and so on. I'm also pleased to be speaking to members of the York Munster Twinning Society, who I know have joined because I gave a talk to them in August as well and touched on a few of these topics. So, what topics is your question? Well, post-Roman Yorkshire is my answer. Much of the research I'll be talking about tonight is based on my third book, Little Kingdoms, An A to Z of Early Medieval Britain. This was published by Pen and Sword in November last year and is, I suppose, the third in a trilogy of early medieval focused books. My first one focused on one little kingdom, this being the Isle of Axome, that's the book on the right. The second one was all about the Viking Age, not really forgotten at all because it's one of the most popular topics of history, of course. And then the third, I wanted to do something different. Instead of focusing on one area of the country in a thousand-year period, and instead of focusing on a really popular topic of history, the Vikings, told in a narrative style, I wanted instead to borrow from one of my favourite TV shows, which is Inside Number 9, made by Reece Shearsmith and Steve Pemberton. This show, for those who aren't aware, is an anthology. So every episode, only 30 minutes long, is completely disconnected from all the others. They tell individual micro narratives one after another. And I wanted to take a similar approach to the myriad little kingdoms that popped up and disappeared between the late Roman period and roughly the early Viking Age. So we're talking about the 5th to 8th centuries. The book occasionally goes either side of that temporal boundary, but for the most part, Little Kingdoms, an A to Z of early medieval Britain, catalogues these lost realms, starting with A, ending in Y, because there isn't a kingdom beginning with Z. And for today's lecture, I'll be focusing on only 10 of those, slightly more than 10 actually, within and around the best county in England, Yorkshire. God's country. I'll be using this beautiful map by an Etsy artist. I've included the link there, and I'm sure I can share it in the chat afterwards. This map is mainly used to illustrate the locations of current important places within Yorkshire and their relation to the various petty kingdoms visualized via this Venn diagram that I'll be talking about. So we're going to be starting with one of the least obscure and working our way down quite the mad list before we get to kingdoms that maybe some of you have never heard of. Now, when I do this talk live, and indeed when I did in December, as I went through this list, the number of people nodding and saying, "Oh, I've heard of this one," gradually decreased to the point where there was basically no one left by the end. Everyone was waiting to have a beer. It was getting quite strange. So we'll carry that forward. First of all, we need to establish a few ground rules. I'm not talking about the Viking period here, nor am I talking about the Roman period. To many, this era is known as the Dark Ages. Now, if you type in Dark Age Britain map or Dark Age Europe, you might be treated with visuals like this. An imaginary landscape of lots of different jigsaw pieces that make up today's England, Wales, and Scotland, scattergunned as if they've been blasted out of a cannon onto a blank canvas. Mercia in the middle, surrounded by all of these different tiny kingdoms. Northumbria there, East Anglia over to the right. Each one confined to a specific area, each one colour coded almost. Speaking of colours, you might be familiar with maps of the migration period around 400 to 500 CE. And these maps typically envision red arrows or green arrows for the Angles, different colour for the Saxons, different colour for the Jutes, and of course we can't forget the Frisians, all going to different places on the British Isles. The Jutes from Jutland, they go to Kent. The Saxons from Saxony, they go to what becomes the heartlands of Wessex, places like Buckinghamshire today. And there's countless decades that have been kind of perpetuating various myths about this migration period. And there's always ongoing arguments between archaeologists, linguists, DNA specialists, and so on. The number of migrants, the number of Anglo-Saxon migrants to Britain during these so-called Dark Ages, flip-flops every now and then. There was a recent brilliant paper by Sam Leggett and a few others that added to this discussion since the previous lecture I gave. But really, the question is, what did people during these Dark Ages think of themselves? Did they think of themselves as Anglo-Saxons? Did they think of themselves as belonging to smaller groups, Angles, Saxons, or Jutes? Maybe they thought of themselves as native Britons, or the Welsh, or something or other. Maybe they gained their identity from a much smaller, more intimate anchor, like an individual kingdom, or tribe, or a kinship group. Now, the story from the alleged breakdown and collapse of late Roman Britain up to the better documented era of seven kingdoms like Wessex, Northumbria, Mercia is a rocky road. Not much was written at the time, certainly not in England. And our documentation has to be retrospective. We have writers like Bede, Gildas, a bloke who's sometimes called Nennius, writing in Wales, and they talk about Angles coming from over here, going over there, all these different kingdoms that rose and fell. And these narratives are very entertaining, they're very interesting. They do contain kernels, sometimes big chunks of truth, but they're also dripping in the webs of political propaganda of the time. So the answer to that rambly diatribe is that we just don't really know what people thought of themselves during these dark ages, dark, reflecting our own ignorance rather than the people of the time. But when we talk about kingdoms, it's in the name of the book, of course, we also need to clear a few ground rules about what exactly we're talking about. We're not talking about set jigsaw pieces on a map, like I mentioned earlier, with different colours. You wouldn't know if you walked from one kingdom to the other, apart from in a few circumstances. There wouldn't be a title screen, as if you were in a video game, telling you you have now entered Northumbria, Zone 1. It's not quite as specific as that. Hence why I've relied on Venn diagrams, which, fun fact, were invented in Yorkshire, in Drypool, near Hull. And we have a few terms from the early medieval period that describe these various kingdoms. Big ones seem to be referred to as provinciae, smaller ones, lacking full autonomy, as regions. But the homogeneity of these terms is up for debate. They're not used overwhelmingly consistently, nor do we use them consistently ourselves. But we're talking about kingdoms, we have to talk about how kingdoms form. Now, in the breakdown of what we might call state authority in the late Roman period, specialists have subscribed to two models, and these models are sometimes referred to as the Anglo-Saxon model versus the Merovingian model. Now, you're probably familiar with Anglo-Saxon, maybe not Merovingian. And these terms describe the degree of political fragmentation from post-Roman Britain over to Merovingian Europe, France and Germany. So in Britain, we effectively have the breakdown of 5 Roman provinces into a whole kaleidoscope of these little kingdoms, some in England, some in Wales, some in Scotland. Whereas in the Merovingian realms, today's France, Germany, areas of the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on, the degree of political consolidation was pretty consistent. There wasn't this mass scattering of territory. It doesn't appear that there was these kind of land grabbing contests. So, how do we then talk about Dark Age Britain, early medieval Britain? If it truly is a labyrinthine maze of all these petty kingdoms, and we really will get to the obscure ones soon, how can we be sure who we're talking about? And can we use these blanket terms like Anglo-Saxon to describe them? Maybe not. I'd argue probably not. Can we call them tribes? Not all kingdom was built equally. In the book, and certainly in today's lecture, you'll meet kingdoms that are as small as a river bend, others that are as vast and nebulous as an idea and aren't bound by maps. We might call some of these kingdoms regimes, or ideologies, or lordships, others tribes, kinship groups, petty kingdoms, realms. The terminologies, you know, they clash. As we are wont to do in our specialities, we debate the exact terminology over and over again. I'm not sure I'm the best person to come up with a concrete list of terms here. Really, the purpose of this book and this talk, as a taster, is to showcase that the traditional narrative of early medieval Britain, as this kind of breakdown from the splendour of Rome into loads of little people in mud huts flinging rocks at one another, it just doesn't add up to weight. Nor was there a concise number of kingdoms. You didn't just have Wessex, Northumbria, Mercia, all these names that many of you will be familiar with. Instead, there really is a vast network of all of these tiny realms, some preserved on charters, others lost to song, some embedded in folklore. This is an example from Essex, or the Kingdom of the East Saxons, just to demonstrate how complicated our terms today and even the terms of the time can be. So, I'm talking about specialists, archaeologists, historians, textual experts, paleographers, the varied people in our beautiful disciplines who study the early medieval period. I'm also talking about models. How do we create frameworks to hang these varied pieces of evidence from? The skeletons for all our meat and gravy, I suppose. Well, one such model is the crudely but aptly named FA Cup model, which envisions a map of England, Wales, and Scotland after Rome, in which loads of these tiny, tiny kingdoms emerged, and they all battled one another over resources. Their names were extinguished, as we can see in these individual brackets. Grimsby versus Stevenage, the big one. And later, all of these tiny kingdoms effectively combine under a homogeneous title. East Saxons here is just an example, but you also have the West Saxons, Wessex, the South Saxons, Sussex. These aren't homogeneous entities that remain fixed onto their modern county dimensions eternally. Rather, they reflect the fluid nature of political expansionism, the varied moods of the leaders, warlords, and so on, their aspirations. They also reflect the wishy-washy nature of international trade, different ideologies, and so on and so forth. We're seeing currently, in real time, how there's nothing inevitable about the rise, fall, or status of even a massive kingdom or an empire. So all of these tiny ones that persisted between the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, they weren't predestined to disappear, nor were the ones that lasted, like Wessex, predestined to become the last kingdom, to become England. So Little Kingdoms is not a narrative of A to B. It's a sprawling maze of all of these beginnings. One reviewer called it a collection of beginnings rather than endings. So if you want endings, I suppose wait till the end of this lecture, but you won't really find any in the book. So we've got that out of the way. We've got some of the terms out of the way. Our forms of evidence, I'll be talking about archaeology, textual records, some retrospective, some contemporary. We've also got a few genealogies, very complicated old Welsh poems. Domesday Book is a real major source of evidence. This is a Norman document. It was called the Great Survey at the time, and it's somewhat useful because it preserves the names and economic assessments of all of these different villages, towns, markets up and down England. And these names, in many cases, do not reflect the language of the Normans. Instead, they reflect vestigial traces of the languages that came before, and also the names of these tiny kingdoms, many of which have no other records. There's a few other pieces of information that I'll talk about soon in terms of sources, but this is what I've been talking about in map form. An imagined breakdown of all of this interconnectivity from the Roman period. Suddenly, no one knew how to use roads. We didn't know how to wash ourselves anymore. That kind of collapse didn't really happen. Rather, the political fragmentation reflects different kind of aims of the time. The Roman Empire was very connected, and when it started to wither, these connections ceased in their importance, but it didn't mean that people reduced to barbarism. Nor were people ever homogeneous or blanketed under one brush, which really is the final point on this intro. Northumbria, like the West Saxons, like the South Saxons, and so on, it's a label that was relatively new by the 8th century, and it describes not an unmoving block of population, but lots of different groups that may have not individually seen themselves as Northumbrians. They may have thought they just belonged to their neighbourhood or their valley or their bit of the coastline. So Northumbrian as a label really kind of was stamped on top, and there'll be many instances of that. And I will talk about the Vikings just at the end, and how helpful or perhaps unhelpful a homogeneous label like Viking Kingdom for a place like York is. And all of this is informed by the kind of sociological study of ethnicity, I suppose, and identity. These are fraught concepts today, and it's very difficult to apply them to the past. So that's why in the book and in today's talk, I won't be using terms like Britain versus Anglo-Saxon, or Anglo-Saxon versus Celt, or Anglo-Saxon versus Picts. Seems like the Anglo-Saxons couldn't get on with anyone, really. Rather, these are local groups. That's kind of the whole point. So, kingdom number one, and I'm sure it's one you've all heard of, Northumbria. Specifically, the northern part, Bernicia. Now, you may be thinking, for those of you who know about Bernicia, for those of you who know about Northumbria in the north, I know we've got a few Bernicians on the call today. It's not in Yorkshire. Well, you're correct. The heartland of Bernicia was probably Bamborough, or Bebenberg. A beautiful place, windswept, very evocative, not really anywhere near Yorkshire, closer indeed to Gateshead, Newcastle. And yet, Bernicia seems to have spread a little bit of an influence over our neck of the woods. This started in earnest in the 7th century through the shifting dynasties and the fortunes of people like Oswald, his brother Oswy, and so on. Now, Bede, a historian from the 8th century, he writes reams about Bernicia and our half of the kingdom, which we'll get to in a second. And Bernicia was the crown jewel in Bede's life. His work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, is brilliant. It's absolutely dripping in Bernician flair. Now, the etymology of this kingdom means something like land of the mountain passes, and it is actually an Old Welsh etymology. The name comes from a Celtic language group, the people we might call the Britons. So it isn't Old English. It's not a Germanic language. So it's not Anglian, as Bede describes it. Here we see the contradictions between contemporary documents and what we can work out today. In even the genealogy of Bernicia and a bunch of other kingdoms, it reflects not sole kin groups, not the Angles coming over and remaining rigid and fixed, but rather the mixing of languages, the mixing of native tongues and foreign ones, different dialects mixing here in northern England. Now, the part that connects to Yorkshire here can be seen through Northumbrian stone sculpture, dating mainly from the late 7th, 8th and early 9th centuries. Now, Bernicia, North Northumbria, if you like, was an absolute powerhouse in terms of art. We can see this through manuscripts, we can see it in objects like the Frank's casket, which may or may not have been made in Whitby. So here we are, promise, we're in Yorkshire. There are also lots of these beautiful standing crosses dotted around Yorkshire. Now, a brilliant thesis from 2006 by Lamont Dobson argued that the similarities with all of these Northumbrian carvings and the proximity of many of them to Whitby and beyond Yorkshire indicates that they originated from the north, from our purple circle on the Venn diagram, and they spread over the rest of Yorkshire as an ideological blanket. Here was Bernicia stamping its feet on top of the other half of Northumbria, which we'll get to in a moment. And in imagining these two halves of Northumbria as places, we're actually doing them a disservice because nowhere in the contemporary documents, especially not in Bede, does he refer to Bernicia as a place. Rather, he refers to the population. Now, you can't box in a population. A population moves like a Venn diagram. They sprawl all over, in this case, Whitby, near to Middlesbrough and Saltburn. But in the 7th and 8th century, Bernicians may well have stalked our Yorkshire moors, our forests, our marshes. Bernicians and the Dayrens, kingdom number 2. The second better half of Northumbria, if I do say so myself. Deira encompasses much of Yorkshire today. It's not really identical with the whole modern county. We don't really know where any of these borders were. The River Tees is usually earmarked as the split between Bernicia and Deira, but we can't really know. There was some good research undertaken into this by Mr. Sherlock. First name is slipping from me. It might be Steve, it might be Simon, I'm not sure. But that was examining cemeteries, and in terms of burial rites between what we think is Bernicia and Deira, there's a lot of different traditions. There's no real homogeneity, which to me indicates that we've got lots of these different local groups with their individual ideas, individual identities. Now, Deira, as one of these fissiparous realms, again has a conflicting etymology. It's not Old English, despite the fact it's described for all intents and purposes as this monolithic block of Anglian might. Rather, the etymology is again Old Welsh. It means something like land of the oak trees. It's a greener place to Bernicia. If Bernicia is characterised, at least linguistically, with mountain passes and cold, unfeeling shores, the frames of dead seals mingling with sand on the strand beneath Bebenberg, then Deira is Hull, Brough, nice flat marshes of East Yorkshire, but also places like the Yorkshire Wolds near the Vale of Pickering. It may have been centred on York, it may have been centred on Driffield, we really don't know. The case for Driffield, I think, is slightly stronger. In the year 705, I believe actually on the 14th of December or the 4th, I'm not too sure, a king was, he passed away there in Driffield. I was about to say was killed, but I think he just died. In any case, it was a royal manor that's been as yet undiscovered. Another centre of power within Deira, based on a recent acquisition by Pocklington District Heritage Trust, may have been Pocklington itself. Indeed, the Vale of Pickering is certainly home to lots of these monumental investments and beyond into places like Pocklington and so on. This object that I'm showing on screen now is one of our pieces of evidence for identifying lordship, or at least for identifying a person of power in the darkest of the Dark Ages. This is a tiny object. Blowing it up on a screen does it an injustice because it's about that big. Really, really small. It's made of gold. It's got several waffled gold foils in there, a few surviving slivers of garnet that have not yet been kind of no mass spectrometry analysis has been undertaken as of yet. But chances are, given these similarities to the Sutton Hoo material, Staffordshire Hoard, and so on, much of the assemblages from Rendlesham in East Anglia, they might also indicate connections from further afield. So this is the Pockeller panel. And Pocklington, again, the etymology denote a person of importance. Pocklington, it means the enclosure of the people of Pockeller. Now, there'll be a few more of these Ingus names as we move through the list of kingdoms. But this is just an example. Deira has no centre that we can find archaeologically. By the 8th century, York was well on its way to becoming a vital trade emporium. But so far, archaeological excavations at places like Fishergate, for example, I know there was a recent one a few years ago that's not yet published. It does indicate that there was a growing community, probably of Frisians from the 8th century, maybe earlier. But was York a political capital of Deira? We're not sure. Really, what we're looking at, I think, in contrast to Benicia's sole centre, or maybe a few centres at places like Bamber and Yeveren, we're looking at loads of different pockets of authority across Deira, lots of little kingdoms that became known retrospectively as one, this being Deira. So that's the two halves of Northumbria. But we're not done yet. We've got 8 more kingdoms to go to. And I chance a guess that many people are familiar with number 3, Elmet. Be this from Ted Hughes' poetic anthology or the book by Fiona Mosley of the same name, which is very good. Elmet is preserved, it's fossilised in popular consciousness due to a number of factors. Still appears on street names. It's been resurrected countless times in books, literature, poems, even a few TV shows, I believe, and certainly a stage play. Elmet is also importantly remembered in a variety of places. So it's a little bit of a weird kingdom to talk about. Yes, there is an Elmet in West Yorkshire. It's near Leeds. Ted Hughes was inspired by it. But there's also Elmets up and down the British Isles. One is referenced on a tombstone in North Wales. There's also a very small, kind of like a tiny district in South Wales that has a very similar root to the word Elmet. And Tim Clarkson, in his 2010 Men of the North, suggests that through one reading of a certain poem that I'll get onto on the next slide, there probably was also an Elmet near Hadrian's Wall. Now, again, like with Bernicia, like with Deira, we might not be reading a description of a place here, but rather a polity or a population or a naming scheme that applied to lots of different places, lots of different groups up and down the British Isles. Andrew Breeze, I think, suggested that the name derives from Old Irish. So again, not Old English. And it means something like many reaping. So it's either a boast about slaughtering enemies or farming or both. Not too sure. I'm also not too sure where Elmet is. One of the major sources that references Elmet is the Old Welsh poem, it's translated as The Gododdin. And this is a beautiful poem. It's been translated lots of different ways. The Gillian Clarke version might be my favourite, I think. In any case, it was probably first written down in the 9th century. Our earliest copies, 13th century in Wales. It's been passed through various dialects, Cumbric at one point. But essentially, it's this big yarn about a big battle that happened somewhere at some point. The details really aren't locked down. Again, like with the use of the term Anglo-Saxon, there are a lot of arguments between different specialists about where the action in this poem took place. A place called Catriath is mentioned repeatedly that might be Catterick, although might does not mean is. And on that ground, many people suggest that the Elmet mentioned in the poem must also be in Yorkshire. But if you unpick the Yorkshire association from Catriath and Elmet, there's really nothing tying this poem to any particular place in England, really, other than Scotland. Because the name of the poem, Gododdin, is also the name of a kingdom that existed somewhere around Edinburgh, which is also in the book, but I won't talk about it today because it's not in the best county in England. Come on! Elmet is, however, or at least it might have been. We don't really know. Like I said, there's 4 Elmets. And whether or not Catterick is this place called Catriath or not, again, doesn't really matter because the archaeology there is fascinating in its own regard. We've got, I think, at least 2 cemeteries or 1 cemetery that's quite large. We've got evidence for possible post-Roman ramparts, I think 5th century, late 4th century. There's also a lot of burial urns, and the material from the RAF cemetery there has close affiliations to metal detected finds from Lincolnshire. So nothing in those cemeteries can really tie the population of Elmet or Catriath to any particular place. Kingdom number four, Lloydis. Now, unlike those examples, Lloydis can be tied to a particular place, and this place is Leeds. So Lloydis, Leeds, the etymology is a lot more secure than these other locations. Leeds is mentioned only a few times in the early medieval period, as Lloydis, mentioned by Bede, but also in the 10th century, in a 10th century hagiography, which is basically a story about a saint. It's referred to as Lloydum Civitatum, and in the context of that story, it serves as a border point between Cumbrian and Danish-speaking parts of Yorkshire. So that's a little later. I mean, that's firmly in the Viking Age. What we're talking about is the earliest attestation of Leeds or Lloydis. And to do that, we have to again talk about Elmet. So I've mentioned all of these different possible Elmets. There is one more that's referenced in a source called the Tribal Hidage. It's number 5 on that list to the left. Now, the Tribal Hidage is another complicated document. We don't really know when it was written, where it was written, who it was written for. Nicholas Hyam suggests that it was written around 625, I believe he says, during the reign of King Edwin of Northumbria, as a punitive list, essentially a document containing how much money everyone owed King Edwin. If you think of it like a mafia protection racket, I always find that's a good analogy for students, although with more crowns and less nice food, I assume. And Elmet, it appears here on this list, along with a few others not in Yorkshire. But it's not written as Elmet, it's Elmid Sartna, which is Old English or Old Frisian for the inhabitants of Elmet. So is this referencing people already there, or a new colony supplanted atop Elmet? Now, Elmet is usually imagined as this kind of romantic, bucolic forest kingdom, greening roots snatching tumbled masonry and dragging it down into Mother Earth's belly. We really don't know. That's the thing. I keep saying we really don't know. And when I teach this for postgraduates and sometimes very bored secondary school students, I also say we don't know. Now, the secondary school students usually say, well, how do you not know? You're a terrible teacher. But that's the fun. A lot of these questions we will never be able to answer. It's just fun to kind of have a wiggle. So Lloydis is one of these mysteries to wiggle. It is described by Bede as a separate place either within or just outside of Elmet, which helps us somewhat in placing the two kingdoms. Both are probably in West Yorkshire. We're not sure of the size or scale of either. But it is referred to as a regio, which, as I mentioned at the start, probably puts it on the second tier of kingdoms. So it had some autonomy, probably didn't have independence, but again, it's more of a spectrum rather than a set tier list. We've also got different Old English terms, Ingus, Wara, Sart, that all mean something like the people of, the inhabitants of, or the followers of. And up and down England, you can see these elements in names and indeed in the book. It goes back to those earlier wishy-washy terms. Now, speaking of wishy-washy, speaking of water, we have to touch on kingdom number 5, Hathfeld Land, which is a mouthful even when sober, doing dry January. Now, that's the brown circle. Brown because it's a very muddy, swampy wasteland. That's what the name means. It means something like open heath field, swampy, uncultivated, waste, wilderness, moor, land, field, land, swamp. Something like that. Margaret Gelling has the correct attestation. But the key things to know about Hathfeld Land, remembered probably in today's Hatfield Chase, or maybe slightly south, is that it was very swampy. We've got this other kingdom, Lindsey, that was centred around Lincoln and the Lincolnshire Wolds. That was effectively an island separated from the mainland of England at the time by a nigh impenetrable salt marsh, the North Sea, and also a number of rivers. There's some evidence for early canal work there as well. So Hathfeld Land, I have to talk about Lindsey in this context because they're both described as one and the same thing in the Tribal Hidage, that source we just mentioned. Hathfeld Land is written as Lindsey with Hathfeld Land. Presumably the solo career didn't last very long. And the fact that these two kingdoms are always placed together has made Hathfeld Land a bit of a liminal space in more than one way. There's no major publication that attacks Hathfeld Land as the other kingdoms have been given. You know, there are a few books written on Lindsey, for example. but none on Hearthfell's land. It may have also had a different name, a place in Old Welsh called Mathan, and philologists in the audience, please forgive my terrible pronunciation. Maybe one and the same. Several battles happened here in the 7th century. I know this because I spent 3 years writing one article for the University of Cambridge. And the evidence for the placement of these battles is multifaceted. The Battle of the River Idle in 616/617, that happened somewhere near Bawtry, where there's a late Roman fort. That's to the south of the Isle of Axholme. In 632, the Battle of Hatfield, wherever that may have been, maybe Hatfield Chase, maybe Cookney in Nottinghamshire. That also happened roughly the same place. 642, the Battle of Mayserfield. Most people place it near Shropshire, although there's a compelling argument that we don't actually know where it was, in which case we're divorced entirely from a battlefield identification. 679, Bede implies there were repeated border raids around the River Trent, so multiple battles happened in the same kind of swampy quadrant. Again, it's fairly unclear where specifically these battles happened, but they did indeed happen around here, which suggests there was some importance to the Isle of Axholme and the Hatfield region more generally. Now, I'm borrowing a phrase here in bold, central because liminal, from the brilliant Frisian scholar Nelleke Ischenegger, who studies the early medieval Netherlands. And the Netherlands, like the Doncaster-Scunthorpe marshes, were both central because they were liminal. Liminal in this case meaning they were on the border of lots of very important neighbours, so they're often forgotten. But being on the border of multiple things means you're in the middle of them. So Hatfield land, be it a wasteland, be it a swamp, whatever, it was on multiple routeways. Roman road passed through it, and also if you're in a boat, a marshland is effectively like King's Cross. So there were multiple reasons why paths kind of converged within Hatfield land, wasteland, swampland, and it funneled kind of corridors of activity. So here on the edge of South Yorkshire, jutting into North Lincolnshire, is this weird fifth mud kingdom that may well have bore lots of much smaller realms, as evidenced by the proliferation of Ingas names. So as mentioned with our East Saxon example, these all mean place of the folk of insert name. Now a good example is recorded in a charter describing Eaton Farm in Surrey. It's a place called Yettingas, or Yettingas. And the person in question here, was he a real person? I don't know. The name appears in Beowulf and in a number of other Old English poems. It was certainly a very popular name, and this place in Surrey was named after him. Does it mean then that this legendary Swedish dynast arrived in Surrey, set up shop, and was remembered for centuries and centuries? Or does it just mean that a very popular name was picked from a reservoir of cool-sounding dynastic titles, and it was then adopted by people later on? So just around the Isle of Axholme, we've got Finningley, we've got Messingham, Immingham slightly further away, and they all mean basically folk of the insert ancestral name. And lots of these places in kind of a very small space all around the rim of a marsh implies that there was a lot of competition. So yes, Hatfield land as a swamp might seem undesirable, and it's in the middle of lots of much more important neighbours, but in being so, it's also central. So somewhere that's less central is Kingdom number 6. Now we're really entering the quite obscure territory here. This is Dunatinga, which is way off in the northwest, nearly in Lancashire and Cumbria, probably centred around Ingleborough. Now our source for this murky realm is in a 7th, 8th century hagiography about St. Wilfrid, who went around much of Northumbria complaining. He went to Rome on 4 occasions to get the king in trouble and to complain about his demotions at work. And in this one entry, the context here is that a Northumbrian king is donating land to him. And in this entry, we have the names of lots of different places. Now, one of them, Region Dunatinga, that I've highlighted, might well be somewhere in Dentdale. There's been suggestions for the Howgill Fells or near Sedberg. David Johnson, one of my idols and a really key inspiration for my book, suggests, I think brilliantly, that Ingleborough with its really prominent silhouette and kind of vast shadow it casts over the Yorkshire Dales. It can be seen for miles. It would have crystallized a sense of identity. So here we're getting into the theoretical side of the book. Um, these are theories ultimately. These are questions to be thought about rather than questions to be answered. But Ingleborough, which has a lot of tantalising archaeological evidence strewn across its summit and slopes, may well have been the centre of this half-remembered, somewhat imagined lost realm. The people of Dunnet, which is, again, an Old Welsh name. How can we be sure? We don't really know. But if you were to type in Dark Age Britain map, chances are this corner of England would be referred to as Reged, which is normally, as you can see here from these examples, imagined as a fixed block of territory onto Cumbria and all of the places in the UK of which we don't know the names for in this period. So the original source that describes Reged is a 12th century poem that lists a character riding on horseback from somewhere in north central Wales to Carlisle through the lands of Reged. Does it mean that whole stretch was one kingdom? Maybe it was an overlordship, a regime that didn't last very long, that temporarily united a lot of these kind of valley-based polities, like Dunnetinga. We're not sure. I think conversations can be more interesting if we stop putting Reged on maps, personally. My argument, I think, is it's a nice sounding name that was picked from a hat in one of these mead hall orations. So the thing about Old Welsh poetry, indeed somewhat Old English poetry, is that what we have now, these wonderful documents that contain the likes of Beowulf and so on, they're fossils. They're one version of a once spasmodic, sprawling literary tradition that would have been different and regionalised depending on where you were in the country. So what we have now seems like it's locked in, but it might not have always been so. Traditions are quite fluid. Our version of the Gododin might not have been the poet's favourite, for example. Now, speaking of favourites, we're on my favourite kingdom. Number 7, Craven. Craven knowledge, you've come to the right place. This is the kingdom of the Yorkshire Dales. Now, Craven is remembered everywhere in the Yorkshire Dales. It's on the front of the brilliant museum in Skipton. It's all over Domesday Book. It's on wheelie bins. What does it mean? We're not sure. It's even inspired a milk company. Craven's origins lie not in the early medieval period, but instead in Domesday Book, wherein 125 villages appear as Skipton in Craven, or Settle in Craven, Horton in Craven. Loads. And they're not all confined to Yorkshire. Some are in Lancashire, some are in Cumbria, and even in Westmoreland as well. It's a massive space. Bigger perhaps than Reged is often thought to be. What does Craven mean? Not sure. David Johnson and P.N. Wood suggest that the etymology derives from something like garlic, and garlic as a herb has a lot of magical connotations in the literature. Apparently it can ward off Saxons and the devil and people who have sex with elves. And the name might also mean something like scraped stones, both of which aptly characterise the Yorkshire Dales. You've got a lot of wild garlic that grows around Malham, got a lot of limestone that bursts through the soil, especially in the southern Dales. Now, the archaeology of the Yorkshire Dales, of what may be Craven, doesn't indicate any form of high status social stratification. Our finds, our sites are farmhouses, barns, a bit of iron ore, and then a few bits from the portable antiquities scheme and miscellaneous burials like this. Indeed, one of our best pieces, I suppose, in terms of high status from the Dales is fragments of a bronze hanging bowl that's on display in Skipton. That's in the bottom left there. There's also several burials that ended up in caves. So there are a lot of caves in the Yorkshire Dales. If this was a kingdom, it's really weird. There isn't an identified central site. Seemingly, there was very little trade. Iron has been traced from the Yorkshire Dales to Cumbria, vice versa. So subsistence may then have just been tied to a very local sphere, sheep and cows, so individual valleys. Now, I mentioned Ingleborough with the previous kingdom, but it might well have implications here for Craven too. So Ingleborough is not a hill fort. Many people assume it is. I mean, it looks like one. It's a good spot for a hill fort, but there's no evidence. There's not really any walls on the top of Ingleborough. There's a lot of cairns that date between Bronze Age, a few pieces of scattered Roman pottery, and also, weirdly, in the 13th century, there's a few place names of presumably Old English origin up and down Ingleborough, one of which means, it's been translated, I think, by Yvonne Luke as speech staff stream. It's a limestone inlier. Imagine a kind of shallow dish in the ground, surrounded by a limestone wall. May have been used as a corralling site. We really don't know. I mean, that's the problem. What we do know is that the Dales is very, very fertile. Brilliant farmland, especially around Malham, which is recorded in spats between various abbeys in the high medieval period as being long contested. Now, this may reflect earlier land claims. Speaking of later documents that reference earlier language, we have to look at the Hebden Township boundary, which uses Old English words to describe marker stones and veins of iron ore. So there's a lot of invisible history in the Yorkshire Dales. Now, I know for a fact much of this is going to be contained within a publication coming soon, which is really exciting. And myself and Leon Cornell Cowell are doing an abridged version of that in an upcoming article. So, can we put Craven on a map? You know, I've done it in my book because I like it, but not really. It's in a recent Max Adams publication, and I love Max Adams. He's a great idol. So if Max Adams has it on a map, then I will too. But I think a more interesting conversation is about the nature of these kingdoms. In the case of Craven, are we looking at a fixed block of territory, a shard of the former province of Roman Britain that became like a pocket universe? Or is this a case of a kingdom being tied not to a place, but to people or a central figure? So this goes back to the argument with Reged. It's so heavily associated with a dude named Urien. It's not really referenced at all if he's not in the poem as well. And Craven and a lot of these individual valleys of the Yorkshire Dales and beyond, they may well have had these tiny kinglets, or petty kings, ruling over each individual valley. So Andrew Fleming, in a really brilliant publication from, I think it was 1998, about Swaledale, which is one of the northernmost valleys in the Yorkshire Dales, he suggested, based on earthworks, that there was a tiny kingdom that was, you know, sandwiched in this one valley. He gave it a name. The theory was later ripped apart by philologists, as they do. But the point is, there's this undeniable obsession with identifying these tiny kingdoms. Maybe we need to kind of divorce ourselves from it and just accept the fact we'll never know the names of lots of these rulers, and in admitting that, I suppose we'll never know the names of lots of these places. So what does Craven mean? No idea. It's still my favourite kingdom. The best thing from Craven, if I go back to these list of burials, is this amazing. It was a double inhumation. The skeleton of note here was a 30-ish-year-old female who'd been pregnant a few times in her life. She was discovered in the car park, I think, of a school near Kettlewell, or in a field near the school, in the late 90s. Now, through the construction process, renovation progress, this burial was moved out of the ground for a while, and the primary school students of Kettlewell wrote poems and drew pictures of the skeleton lady. That's what they called her, the skeleton lady. Later, she was nicknamed Olwyn, early medieval name. And this lady, whatever her name was, whatever her life had been like, she was reburied with these objects, with these ephemera. And that is a resident of Craven, in some ways, and lost to the shadows of time, I suppose. You know, Craven in this case is an imagined construct. It's not a real place. Maybe Craven is the friends we make along the way. So, on to a, I suppose, less interesting kingdom now. We're away from the Yorkshire Dales. We're near Rotherham. It's not quite the Yorkshire Dales, but it's three kingdoms in one we're talking about here. Morthon, which is a tiny unit of some administrative control, centred perhaps on a 10th century hall, may have been a church, which later became a Norman Motte and Bailey castle. Here we see administrative continuity between the 10th and 12th centuries. Does this mean that prior to the Norman conquest, we're not looking at a case of the Normans making a new centre of power, but rather adapting one that was already there? And if we subscribe to that latter theory, what then does that mean about our map of little kingdoms? Are we looking at lots of these, you know, 9 visible centres of power in these petty kingdoms? It's difficult to say, but we have a few other examples. One near Pontefract, also Berkshire, sometimes called Claro, which is an Old Norse judicial district that's again remembered in Domesday Book, and judging by the distribution of hordes there, may have been centred on, or at least near to Harrogate. But again, no documents talk about it until Domesday Book. So are these the littlest of little kingdoms? Maybe. If only charters mentioned them. Now, charters were an absolutely amazing source for me when I was writing my book. In terms of Yorkshire, they're, I suppose, somewhat less helpful than they are in other counties. Interestingly, while charters from the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, they all reference places like Wessex, and even some minor regions like Surrey, none mention Elmet. They refer to places that are now called Sherburn in Elmet, but they only refer to them as Sherburn, which to me suggests that Elmet wasn't even remembered at the time. Maybe it was resurrected later on. Again, working on a paper with Leon about that. Now, I do highly recommend you check out the link there. That's the online database of, they're called Sawyer charters. I used like 100 when writing the book. Basically, my search history is buggered now because it's just charters. I was once accused of going too far when I started to get into Old English charters. They really are great. They're not boring. I sound mad. Charters are not boring. They're not these kind of placid legal accounts of who owned what where. Again, to use a modern parallel, these charters that contain information of land ownership, they're all manipulated, they're all biased. So when you read one, it doesn't just tell you kind of unmoving facts, but rather viewpoints of the time. So these charters, key resource, none of them mention any of these places. They do, however, I suppose other documents do, mention a place called Hripsatna, which is Ripon, centre of the universe. Now, I'm speaking about charters, they're pretty mad. I think I include this list in the book, which is, I must say, the littlest of little kingdoms. These places, many of which we can't place on a map, they all mean something like the inhabitants of. The prefixes here, I think, mean something like crag, bean, moss, elm trees. So it's essentially populations tied to resources. Now, did the people of, let's say, Craigsartner refer to themselves as the Craig Boys? No. But an administrator from a far removed viewpoint clearly knew them as that. And that's what's preserved in a document. So it goes back to any form of document. It's essentially a fossil, not reflecting the fluctuating nature of these polities. Now, Ripon falls into this bracket of these tiny Sartner territories, as does Repton, which has a very similar etymology. Now, Repton, of course, not in Yorkshire, but still interesting. Viking Army camp there, for example. And Ripon, what was it like in this period? Clearly an important religious centre. It's tied to St Wilfrid. Unfortunately, didn't really have the space to dedicate a whole chapter to Ripon, although a second edition maybe would remedy that. In any case, Hripsatna is very small. It's a little kingdom. Finally, we get to our last kingdom, or kingdoms, because we're talking about York. Now, York, on multiple occasions throughout its history, which is best observed by looking at all its different names, may well have been the core of a lost realm or some petty dominion. Now, I've highlighted them in bold. So, York, its history, although there were things there before the Roman legions stamped their hobnails into the shores of the River Ouse, the first name for it comes from the Greek, but it's been rendered at that point into Latin. And it means something like fortress of the yew trees. Now, that descended into Old English, number 3, as trading place of the boars, because the visual similarity perhaps between Old English for boar and Latin / Old Welsh for yew tree. Bit of confusion there with the naming. Now, in between the Roman and Old English periods, remembered in the 9th century, might be a 6th century name. It gets quite confusing, this. Um, and that number two there in bold, it's remembered in connection to literary traditions that have now spawned nursery rhymes. If anyone's heard of Old King Cole, he's a figure whose possible real life counterpart is associated with York in the 9th century history of the Britons. So York may have been at one point the centre of a very small vestigial Old Welsh speaking polity, like Elmet. In the 10th century, we're on somewhat firmer ground. York is described as Eowythykingas, which means the people of York. So again, following those naming conventions from some other places we've looked at, it might well indicate that here was a concise population that tied its identity, regional, local, to a well-knit, by this point, Anglo-Scandinavian, Old Norse, Old English, Old Frisian speaking trading hub. And York was important, we know this. As I said earlier, we don't know if it was the capital per se of Deira. Maybe it was its own thing. It might have been juggled between lots of other places. Only in the Viking Age can we be sure that York had some kind of unique political autonomy. Now, this was as Jorvik, which is referred to in some literature and some museums as a Viking kingdom or a Viking city. Now, it was wholly polyethnic. It wasn't just Scandinavians living here, nor was the only language Old Norse. You would have had Frisians, Balts, Finns, Arabic speakers, not to mention the plentiful Old English bilingual population. So was Jorvik a kingdom at any point? Was it a little kingdom? Can we add it to our list? Yes, but a very short-lived one. So it emerges out of the gloom of the post-Viking army period in the late 9th century, ruled over by a number of puppet kings and people with very small kind of molecules of power. If you look at the coinage distribution, York was very rich, but if the kingdom of York had the influence to, conquer neighbouring territories by that point, doesn't look like it. The very popular, perhaps infamous figure of Eric Bloodaxe is associated with the final days of the Kingdom of York, Kingdom of Jorvik, and he died in 954, quite far outside the walls near the Yorkshire Dales. So if he was within his kingdom at that point, it clearly was quite weak, quite vulnerable perhaps to internal manipulations, or maybe the kingdom was so small and he strayed too far beyond its edges. We really have various theories to consider. Finally, got a bonus kingdom for you, which is number 11, the land of the holy people, common folk devoted to the man of God, in black there, right at the top. Now, I mentioned at the start that in my book, in this talk, we have kingdoms that aren't tied to specific places. Now, the Helluva Folkland, Holy Folkland, is one such. It doesn't appear on my map in the book, which, can I just say, took me absolutely ages to draw. Doesn't appear on the map, because this is a place that only appears in legal documents from the 12th century onwards. And it's effectively a roaming polity centred on the corpse of St Cuthbert that was moved around during the period in which the kingdom of Jorvik was at its height. Now, if you were to read the literary traditions from this time period, there's an enforced binary between Christian, religious, holy people dedicated to St Cuthbert and the pagan, barbaric Scandinavian raiders. And this duality may well have eroded a sense of, I suppose, a Viking identity here on the edge of Yorkshire, closer really to Durham, as a non-Viking identity blossomed. So I've just included that there as a little bonus treat, I suppose. And that's all 11 kingdoms. 11 out of 63 chapters, but in earnest, there's many more names in there that didn't warrant a full chapter. Limited to a footnote or one line of sentence or only a bibliographic reference. So, if you enjoyed that, please tell me your favourite kingdom. Mine is Craven, for obvious reasons, but I'm also partial to Hatfield Land, because I'm from there. That was my list of post-Roman Yorkshire polities. Now, I do hope you enjoyed, and I welcome any questions, provided they aren't about kingdoms outside of Yorkshire, because they're not worth talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Right, I'm just going to stop the recording, hopefully, before we do